بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on Mutammimat al-Ajrumiyya, we're in Bab al-Mubtada wal-Khabar, and the Mubtada and Khabar is of the most critical chapters ultimately in Arabic grammar, because there are a lot of critical investigations that get added to this chapter. Of the 100 awamil that are, for example, defined by Imam al-Birgivi, there's one amil, right, that is ma'nawi, and that is the amil related to the mubtada. And there is a grammatical significance to it, and there's a practical significance to it, because 50% of sentences are, there's two types of sentences. One type of sentence is the mubtada and khabar, and then in this text, the author of the Mutammimah has added many things to what's there in the Ajrumiyya itself, and refined some of the things that are there in the Ajrumiyya. So, as we've been encouraging, almost begging to please make sure that you are writing out the Mutammimah in a logical manner, that you are diagramming it, and right, and of course then also that you're doing the i'rab of the Quranic examples mentioned in the text. These are all critical, right? And inshallah, after the chapter on Mubtada and Khabar, I would like to see people's notes, right? Next week, inshallah, because this is very significant. This chapter, he mentions a number of Quranic examples, but I'd like to see full notes from the beginning, right? Notes. Of course, those who've joined late, you have a bit of an exemption, but I'd like to see the notes taken so far, right? And then the subsequent chapters to the Bab al-Mubtada wal-Khabar build on that, because there are things that enter upon the Mubtada and Khabar. Bab al-Awamil al-Dakhilati ala al-Mubtada'i wal-Khabar. These are called the Nawasikh, so that's what's coming next. So, he tells us, rahimahullah, that after he gave us a definition of the Mubtada. Al-Mubtada huwa al-ismu al-marfu' al-'ari 'an al-'awamil al-lafdhiyya. Right? The Mubtada is the al-ism al-marfu', the ism in a state of raf'a, al-'ari 'an al-'awamil al-lafdhiyya, free of any lafzi awamil. Right? Which are many. Right? So, one objection that we raised last week was that, are you saying that I really have to think of 99 awamil and exclude these? One of the answers to that, pointed to by the commentator of the on the Kawakib al-Durriya al-Ahdal, is that those that it doesn't have the awamil that relate to the ism, right? Right, which are the, right? So there's an ism. So it's an ism, free of those. So it's not a fi'l, etc. So this definition, you should feel the problem with this definition. That does this definition help me identify the khabar? Right? And this is why the critical thing to appreciate, right, that what is being excluded by the awamil al-lafdiyya, right? He says, rahimahullah, واحترز بالعوامل اللفظية عن العامل المعنوي. What is being excluded by the عوامل اللفظية is the عامل المعنوي. Is the عامل that is معنوي, وهو الابتداء, which is that it's begun with, right? الذي هو تجرد الاسم للإسناد, right? Right? Which is that this ism is there to be talked about, للإسناد إليه, right? And that's the عامل of the مبتدأ, right? It's معنوي, which is الإسناد إليه. And we've mentioned about wanting to look for other definitions of the mubtada. And he explained that there are two قسمان ظاهر ومضمر وهو أنا وأخواته التي تقدمت في فصل المضمر. And we've taken the مضمر before, right? The types of ضمير أنا, etc. Okay. And then he tells us about the ظاهر, right? والظاهر قسمان, right? والظاهر قسمان, right? مبتدأ له خبر ومبتدأ له مرفوع سد مسد الخبر. So the مبتدأ that is ظاهر is of two types. Right? The first is the default, which is مبتدأ له خبر. Right? A مبتدأ that takes a خبر. And as the commentators say, وهو الأكثر في كلامهم. This is what we know. زيد قائم. Right? Right? And another, right, is مبتدأ that doesn't have a khabar, but it has a marfu' that takes the place of the khabar. Right? Right? Such as if, له مرفوع, whether it's a fa'il or something like it, سد مسد الخبر. It took the place of the khabar. Right? Such that with the presence of this, the khabar was not needed. Right? And this marfu' has conditions, right? It needs to be an ism ظاهر or a ضمير منفصل, and he'll tell us about it. فالأول, right? فالأول نحو الله ربنا, right? ومحمد رسول الله, right? Right? And that, of course, is an ayah of that's a statement, but it's also an ayah in the Quran. Right? So if you see the Kawakib al-Durriya, he does i'rab of it because it's an ayah of the Quran. Right? Muhammadun Rasulullah. Muhammad mubtada, Rasul khabar, right? And lafzul jalala mudafun ilayhi. Right? Right? Now, so that's the plain vanilla mubtada, right? Mubtada lahu khabar. والثاني, right, which is a mubtada la khabara lahu, the mubtada that doesn't have a khabar, but has that has a marfu', sadda masad al-khabar, هو اسم الفاعل is the اسم فاعل. واسم المفعول إذا تقدم عليهما نفي أو استفهام. right? إذا تقدم عليهما نفي أو استفهام نحو أقائم زيد. right? So the اسم فاعل or the اسم مفعول, if is preceded by a nafi, a negation, or istifham, a question. أقائم الزيدان و ما قائم الزيدان و هل مضروب العمران. right? So أقائم الزيدان, this Hamza is Hamza istifham. right? Hold on. Where are you? Where's the book? Okay. So the Hamza is Hamza of istifham. right? What is qa'im? Qa'im is an ism fa'il. So the ism fa'il, what does it take? Ism fa'il takes a yeah. So, but in this case, the Zaydan is So what's the i'rab? Okay, so almost the premise is that the ism fa'il or the ism maf'ul, if it's preceded by a nafi, in this first example, in the by nafi or istifham, nahu aqaimun zaydan, this is istifham. Ma qaimun zaydan, this is the nafi. The ma here is of negation. Right? So here the mubtada is az-Zaydan is a mubtada. The fa'il, right? There's a marfu' sadda masadda al-khabar. There's no khabar here. There is no khabar. There's something marfu' that's in the place of the khabar. Right? So, أقائم الزيدان, right? The i'rab, and this is where the kawakib is very nice because it gives the i'rab of everything. Right? So, the hamza is of istifham. Ma, يعني أقائم الزيدان. You have أقائم الزيدان or أقائم زيد. Yeah. Right, so there's different copies, all pretty much equally poor. Right? But either way, أقائم زيد, right? So the Hamza is of istifham, okay? right? أقائم, right? زيد. What's the i'rab? Right? قائم is مبتدأ, right? اسم فاعل يعمل عمل الفعل, يرفع الفعل وينصب المفعول. And زيد is فاعل, سد مسد الخبر, right? Right? So أقائم زيد. همزة is استفهام, قائم is اسم, is the مبتدأ, right? Right? It's an اسم فاعل. It takes, اسم فاعل acts like a فعل. It puts a فاعل in رفع and a مفعول in نصب. زيد is فاعل, and زيد سد مسد الخبر. Right? Similarly, the next example, ما قائم الزيدان. Right? ما قائم الزيدان. Right? ما is نافية, right? And it behaves like ليس. قائم, right? Right? So ما قائم الزيدان behaves differently, right? 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 ما قائم الزيدان. قائم here is اسم of ما الحجازية, right? It's in رفع by the ضمة of its آخر, and قائم is the اسم فاعل, and زيدان is فاعل سد مسد الخبر for ما الحجازية, right? And it can also be done i'rab in a different way, that it's because there's two types of ma, and this actually came up in the Awamil of Birgivi as well. They refer to it as ma hijaziyya and ma taymiyya. It's got a tamimiyya, not taymiyya. I was thinking of Ibn Bani Tamim in the Hijaz, and that's a predominant. This ma behaves like laysa, يعني يرفع الاسم وينصب الخبر, right? So ما قائم is زيدان, right? The ما here is نافية. قائم is اسم of ما, علامة رفعه ضم آخره ما قائم, right? And قائم is اسم فاعل. The اسم فاعل قائم takes a خبر which is الزيدان here. So the زيدان is a فاعل مرفوع يعني علامة رفعه, it's مؤنث, right? So and الزيدان here is فاعل مرفوع سد مسد الخبر. So again, this مرفوع takes the place of the خبر, right? Right? So where is the مرفوع سد مسد الخبر? In the first example, it's زيد, يعني أقائم زيد. In the second, ما قائم الزيدان, the زيدان is فاعل سد مسد الخبر, right? And they gave reason why you did not need a khabar here. Why you did not need a khabar here? And it's explained briefly in the Fawaqih al-Janiyah, and a little more detail in the Kawakib. So those are two examples of the ism fa'il. Then he gives examples of the ism al-maf'ul. Right? You can see the deliberateness of his structuring. Though if you were paying attention, you'd notice that there's a minor disruption in the order of the examples. What was the disruption in the order? In the matan? Yeah. So you mentioned that it could be إذا تقدم عليها نفي أو استفهام. But he gives the istifham first and then the nafi second. That normally, and it appears to be incidental and not for some clear reason. Right? Okay. So what are the examples then? This مثال الاسم المفعول يعني with the istifham نحو هل مضروب العمران. Right? هل مضروب العمران. Right? So here هل مضروب العمران. هل is, what is هل? هل is what? What is it? There's no istifham. Is it a harf? Is an ism? It's a harf of istifham, right? Right? So هل is harf istifham. مضروب is the مبتدأ, right? Right? وعلامة رفعه ضم آخره. And مضروب is اسم مفعول. اسم مفعول يعمل عمل الفعل. يرفع يعني نائب الفاعل وينصب المفعول. Right? العمران نائب الفاعل سد مسد الخبر علامة رفعه الألف لأنه مثنى. Right? So هل مضروب العمران. Right? And the reason being, it resembles the fi'l. Right? It resembles the fi'l. And they have a few tests of why it resembles a fi'l. We don't need to go into what those tests are. Okay. Bismillah. Then, what's the next example? ما مضروب العمران. ما مضروب, what is ما? Right? This ma is? Yeah, ma nafiya, but what kind of ma? Okay, no. I want your answer, not reading the answer, right? Yeah, it's Hijaziyya, right? Right? Because the other Tamimiyya behaves differently. Yeah, but the Hijazi is the default, right? So this ma, you can also say call it ma nafiya. ما مضروب العمران. Right? Madrub is the ism of ما الحجازية. Right? And its علامة رفع is ضم آخره. And مضروب is اسم مفعول يعمل عمل الفعل يرفع نائب الفاعل. Right? And عمران is نائب فاعل سد مسد خبر of ما. Right? So that is the mubtada and khabar and some of its states. Right? Right? Now, the mubtada, right? The mubtada is being talked about, right? The mubtada is being talked about. So, if something is being talked about, the asl is that it's definite. Otherwise, what are you talking about? Right? Right? So that's why he mentions now, right? So first he mentioned the definition, right, of the mubtada and its two types. But now he mentions things that resemble its conditions. They resemble its conditions. So he says, وَلَا يَكُونُ نكرة أي لا يكون المبتدأ نكرة إلا بمسوغ. The مبتدأ is not indefinite except with a permitting factor. والمسوغات كثيرة. Right? There are many. Some took it to the dozens. Some, he mentions 30 something, right? Right? But there's, right, because the basis is, if you are talking, because we said what's one of the signs of the ism? Al-isnad ilayhi. Right? That's of the additions of the mutammima to the ajrumiyya is al-isnad ilayhi. Wal-ismu yu'raf bi. What does the ajrumiyya say? Wal-ismu yu'rafu bi. Right? But we mentioned in the Ajurmiyya lessons that there's one alama that wasn't mentioned, that's the most important alama. Now this comes up in Ashmawi, for example. I don't know if it's mentioned by Sheikh Muhyiddin Abdul Hamid in the Tuhfa Saniyya, but we mentioned it in passing there. Right? And this is Anfa'ul Alamat. Now, you have you have the musnad and the musnad ilayhi. Right? So if you're going to talk about it, you think about simple sentences. Don't look ahead, or if you've actually prepared, and I'm not being particularly optimistic. I think once you're 45, you're allowed to be grumpy. But think of a simple sentence where the mubtada could be indefinite. Right? It's problematic. Right? You can say Zaydun qa'im. We say Rajulun qa'im. Rajul is what? Is nakira. Are you satisfied with Rajulun qa'im as a full sentence? Someone says Rajulun qa'im. If you said هذا رجل قائم, then okay. Yarhamukumullah. Right? That, I'm saying, okay, I'm satisfied. But, right? Because the purpose of a sentence is not fulfilled. Right? Yani, what does mufid mean? No, Arabic. No. We're talking about the definition of kalam. الكلام هو اللفظ المركب المفيد بالوضع. What is mufid? In the definition of kalam. Right? يعني بحيث يحسن سكوت المتكلم يعني عندها. Right? يعني يفيد فائدة تامة بحيث يحسن سكوت المتكلم عندها. Someone stops, you're like, okay. Someone just comes in, رجل قائم. No, so wouldn't say okay. You wonder من أين كيف, right? Say هذا رجل قائم خلاص, because of the هذا, it's a complete sentence. Right? Like if you say إله واحد, right? You'll be waiting for something before or after. Say هو إله واحد خلاص. Right? But, right? So that's why, what does Al-Fakihi say here? Right? He tells us لأن يعني لا يكون إلا نكرة لأن الغرض من الإخبار الإفادة وهي منتفية إذا كان المبتدأ نكرة. The purpose of إخبار is to convey a full meaning. Right? So, right? And Al-Azhari puts it quite nicely. So Al-Ahdal here quotes Al-Azhari, who said, وَلَا يُبْتَدَأُ بِنَكِرَةٍ. One doesn't, in the general case, we'll see that unless there's an permitting exception, لأنها مجهولة, because the nakira is undefined. There's a whole distinction between the nakira and the ma'rifah. The ma'rifah is defined, it's specific. لأنها مجهولة لا تفيد غالبا. So in the general case, غالبا لا تفيد, أي لأن المبتدأ محكوم عليه بالخبر. Because the mubtada, you are affirming something regarding it through the khabar. والحكم على المجهول لا يصح. And to affirm something about something unknown is not sound. لا يصح من حيث أداء معنى تام يحسن السكوت عنده. Right? And that's the main part that we wanted to mention from the Kawakib. You can see, so the Kawakib is quite useful for these things. The most fruitful way of using the Kawakib al-Durriya is to touch just selectively. So here, for example, to appreciate the nuance, this much you take. Because you can get lost in the details of the Kawakib. Okay. ومنها, so he says, والمسوغات كثيرة. مسوغ, of course, من وجد خيرا فليحمد الله. If anyone actually looked up المسوغات, they could say Alhamdulillah. What does the word musawwigh means? The root, this is how you pick up roots. Do you know the root of sawwagha, yusawwighu? What does it mean? Yeah, right? So anyone look it up? Alhamdulillah. So what's the root mean?
That's something that supports something else.
Yeah, right? So do that. Like always check the root. Now, what is the root connotations? And you build up, okay, then you find the same word comes up in the Quran, comes up in the Hadith, or comes up in other usage. So you know, right? So المسوغات كثيرة, right? So he says منها أن يتقدم على النكرة نفي أو استفهام, right? Right? That before the nakira there be a negation or a question. And the reason there is, let's look at the example, and the reason will be quite clear. Because الأمثلة توضح نحو ما رجل قائم. Right? That's the example, right? نحو ما رجل قائم. So it's an example of nafi, right? So say رجل قائم. Would you be satisfied with that statement? Unless there's a, right? Of course, unless something came before. من, yeah, be far-fetched. Anyways, let's not go into the far-fetched, right? رجل قائم is not sufficient as a sentence. But if you say ما رجل قائم, right? Even in English, you say man standing. It's not a complete sentence. The man is standing. Of course, in English grammar works different. You can't make qiyas, so you can say in English, a man is standing. Right? But in Arabic, it doesn't work. But when you have a negation, right? The negation is general. ما رجل قائم. There is no man standing. The nakira تفيد العموم. Right? And they call it تفيد تعميم الأفراد. Right? So it's like definiteness. There's no man standing. Right? ما رجل قائم. أي لا يوجد رجل قائم. Right? أفادت العموم. Right? And sometimes called عموم الأفراد. I think that's what. Right? Yeah. Alhamdulillah. أفادت عموم يعني. Right? لأن النكرة إذا وقعت في حيز النفي أفادت العموم. Right? Right? Because if you say مر رجل قائم, the man is not standing. But you say ما رجل قائم, you're negating any man standing. Right? So by this generalization, you've made it definite. You made it like the definite. Right? Right? Because and it's a nice explanation given by Al-Fakihi. Right? إذ لا تعدد في جميع الأفراد بل المجموع أمر واحد. ما رجل قائم. Right? Like it's as if the category of men is not standing. Right? So it gives it definiteness. Right? This gives it definiteness. So the mubtada could be indefinite if it's preceded by nafi. Right? Right? هل رجل جالس. Right? Right? وهل رجل جالس. The similar thing happens with istifham. هل رجل جالس. هل رجل. Again, it convey. You say هل الرجل جالس. It's very different. Right? It's the man. But you say هل رجل. It's like you say, هل رجل جالس? As if you're saying, هل أي رجل جالس? Is there any man standing? So what does that do? It gives a meaning of ta'meem. So it's like it being definite, right? So it's like it being definite. Therefore, Therefore, it was allowed for the mubtada here to be nakira. ومنها أن تكون موصوفة. Right? If the nakira is موصوفة. Right? منها أن تكون النكرة موصوفة. Did I miss something? هل الرجل إله مع الله? Do you have that? إله مع الله. That's istifham, right? نحو قوله إله. It didn't have it in my copy. That's why I'm looking. I'm now resorted to 3 different copies to try to get the method correct. Right? إله مع الله. And there may be difference of this being in some copies and not others. But yeah, 2 copies have it, right? From Surah An-Naml. Ilahun ma'allah. Right? So what is the ilahun ma'allah? What's the i'rab? Yeah, the hamza of istifham. And it's called istifham inkari. Because the istifham haqiqi is you're asking a question. Right? If I ask, akalt, did you eat? I'm asking you a question. But ilahun ma'allah, is it up for question? No. This is called istifham inkari. Right? Ilah here is mubtada. Ma'a is ظرف مكان. لفظ الجلالة, right, is في محل مضاف إليه, and the ظرف and what is connected to it is متعلق بواجب محذوف تقديره كائن في محل رفع خبر المبتدأ. What's the shahid is ilah is in the indefinite. Why is it allowed to be in the indefinite? Because it's تقدم عليه ماذا؟ يعني استفهام. Okay. So we'd missed that. Then منها أن تكون موصوفة. منها أن تكون النكرة موصوفة. نحو قوله سبحانه وتعالى ولعبد مؤمن خير. Right? 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 Because the wasf entails takhsis. Wasf entails takhsis. So the nakira mawsufa resembles the ma'rifa min jiha. Right? Because al-abd, abdun khayrun, right? Yani wala abdun mu'minun. Abdun mu'min, because abd could be mu'min or kafir. By specifying it as being mu'min, it gives it taswir for making it, for it being in nakira. Right? This is the context of وَلَعَبْدٌ مُؤْمِنٌ خَيْرٌ. Right? In the first, you could do the i'rab of it. This lam is for emphasis. Right? This lam is for emphasis. Okay? It's called lam al-ibtida. Abd mubtada, mu'min sifa, khair is the khabar of the mubtada. And then another musawwigh is ومنها أن تكون مضافة. And منها أن تكون ماذا؟ النكرة مضافة. منها أن تكون النكرة مضافة. نحو 5 صلوات كتبهن الله, which is the hadith of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? 5 صلوات كتبهن الله. خمس is what? Is a mubtada. Is it? Right? 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 And the context, of course, this is from the hadith of the Arabi. The ulama love mentioning it. And all kinds of interesting things happened in the hadith of the Arabi, because the Arabic and the hadith is mentioned in the Kawakib al-Durriya, right? Because the Arabi asked the Prophet, هل علي غيرها يا رسول الله? The Prophet said, لا إلا أن تطوع. So he said, والله لا أزيد على هذا ولا أنقص. I won't do any more or less. So the Prophet ﷺ said, أفلح إن صدق. Right? Right? So the i'rab, خمس is mubtada and it's mudaf. صلوات is mudaf إليه. كتب is فعل ماض. The ha is ضمير متصل في محل نصب, etc. So where's the shahid? Allah is the fa'il, مرفوع علامة رفعه ضم آخره. Right? So where is the yeah? Why? مضاف to صلوات, right? Right? خمس صلوات. So the mubtada is nakira, but it's mudaf. And just make a note that this is from the hadith of the Arabi, right? Because loads of interesting things happen to the Arabi. Because of multiple Arabis that are mentioned, but this Arabi who asked this question, there's disagreement whether multiple parts of the hadith are one Arabi or multiple. Okay? One of the things the Sahaba did, sometimes they deliberately didn't mention someone's name because they did something embarrassing. So sometimes they wouldn't mention their name. Right? They knew his name, but they didn't mention it. Right? Okay. So that's an example of it being mudaf. ومنها أن يكون الخبر ظرفا أو جارا ومجرورا مقدمين على النكرة نحو عندك رجل وفي الدار امرأة ونحو قوله تعالى ولدينا مزيد. Right? So another case is if the khabar is a dharf, right? Or a jar and majroor, and it comes before the mubtada that's in nakira, right? على النكرة أي على المبتدأ that is nakira. نحو عندك رجل. So عند is what? Is ظرف and مظروف. رجل is the mubtada and it's nakira, but because of this taking place, right, of taqdeem of the ظرف, right, عند is ظرف مكان مفعول فيه, right? كاف is في محل جر بالإضافة, and the ظرف and the مظروف is في محل رفع خبر مقدم, and رجل is مبتدأ مؤخر, right? في الدار امرأة جار مجرور, and امرأة is the خبر مؤخر, right? And of course, sometimes in i'rab, even scholars who admit that the jar and majroor is not the khabar, but they just call it khabar, just yallah, let's go on. And you see that in the i'rab of al-Fakihi, متعلق بخبر محذوف تقديره كذا وكذا وكذا. They won't do that, even though we'll take that. Can the khabar be jar and majroor? Okay, so we'll see that whole analysis in a moment. Okay. ولدينا مزيد, right? لدى is ظرف مكان, right? And this is an amazing verse, of course, right? 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 لدينا, right? لدى has some discussion regarding how does لدى work, but it's a ظرف مكان مفعول فيه مبني على الفتحة, على فتحة مقدرة على آخره, right? نا is ضمير متصل في محل جر بالإضافة, right? And these are in the place of رفع خبر. مزيد is مبتدا مؤخر, right? Now, here it's good. You don't necessarily need to read the whole point, but the author of the Kawakib here, the relationship between ladun and lada, right? ظرف of makan, and they can be ظرف zaman and ظرف makan, like عند. Right? And there's a good discussion regarding them. And of course, here, in all of these, there are many lessons. لدينا مزيد, and with us is that which is much more. Right? And there's a difference between ziyada and mazid. And, right? لهم ما يشاءون عند ربهم. That's the verse. They shall have whatsoever they wish with their Lord. وَلَدَيْنَا مَزِيد, and with us is that which is far greater. And mazid has the active sense, right? That which is not just much more, but it's more and more, right? And that's why it doesn't hurt to read the tafsir of some of these verses, right? وَلَدَيْنَا مَزِيد. And the next example he gives, so this is an example of either a mubtada of the ظرف is muqaddam to it, or jar al-majrur muqaddam. وَعَلَى أَبْصَارِهِمْ غِشَاوَةٌ. على أبصارهم جار المجرور, غشاوة is مبتدأ مؤخر, but غشاوة is indefinite. What allowed it to be indefinite? Because something came before it. So that the ظرف or the jar majroor both give it a sense of specificity. So it took on some of the resemblance of something being ma'rifah, and therefore the nakira could serve as the mubtada. And also because of simply the usage of the Arabs. But it's a logical usage that it conveys a full meaning. في الدار امرأة. Okay. فلا أدخل. So I won't go in. Allah. Now, the common case is for the mubtada to be explicit, right? For the mubtada to be explicit. And that's a straightforward example. But sometimes there's a mubtada, but it's in hiding. Right? There's a mubtada, but it's in hiding. What's the case of the mubtada in hiding? وقد يكون المبتدأ مصدرا مؤولا من أن والفعل. And what's the example of that? وأن تصوموا خير لكم. وأن تصوموا خير لكم. أي صومكم خير لكم. So أن تصوموا خير لكم, this is where you have two levels of i'rab. You have two levels of i'rab. A basic level of i'rab is what? An is, what is an? How do we define an? What? No, an is not of tawqid. No, but how do we talk about the an? Right? So an, the first thing to begin with talking about any word is, what is it? Is it an ism, a harf, a fi'l? What is it? Harf. Right? So they typically call it a harf masdari wa nasb. Right? And that's how they talk about it in, right? An harfu masdarin wa nasb. Right? And the reason they mention it's harf masdari is because of what it does, right? Because تصوم فعل مضارع منصوب وعلامة نصبه حذف النون والواو الجماعة ضمير متصل في محل رفع فاعل. تصوم is فعل فاعل, right? Right? The واو الجماعة is ضمير متصل في محل رفع فاعل. But that's أن تصوموا. But then how does it connect to the rest of the sentence? أن تصوموا خير. What's خير doing there? Because normally what does a fi'l do? A normal fi'l takes fa'il and then takes maf'ul and then and the other add-ons to a sentence, right? There could be a jar, majroor, all these kinds of things that take place. But what is this khayrun doing there? Right? And that's where they didn't just say, okay, let's be fancy, so let's say complicated things are happening. But the an, wherever it comes consistently, it behaves in this way. Because the an has this function. We talked a little bit about it in the Birgivi class, and you can review there. And if you have any of the shuruh of the awamil, they're quite useful, like Tuhfatul Awamil. Has a bigger name, but it's famous as Tuhfatul Awamil. It's a nice commentary. Of course, you want to do some practice of i'rab, and if there's evidence that you guys need both to review the awamil and practice your i'rab, is you could do a reread together of the awamil. It'd be quite useful, right? It's easy because you've done it before. So go through it. Just read. And Tuhfat al-Awamil, and there's different i'rabs of the awamil. Those are useful because it will give you some practice. Because things like this should now be intuitive, guys. There's ample evidence that we are not reviewing we're not doing the i'rab. Right? So the an and tasumu, right? They typically say an wa ma ba'daha fi ta'wili masdar taqdiruhu sawmukum. Right? So that's fi ta'wili masdar. And this masdar is the mubtada. And the khair is khabar. So it's important, right? The fact that an is harfu masdariyan, right? Because an tasumu, you say an harf nasb. No, it's not just harf nasb. the fact that it's masdari is significant to the i'rab of the full statement. Right? So that's a little bit of what's mentioned about the mubtada. So mubtada defined has two aspects we mentioned in the definition. The critical component to be aware of, الخالي عن العوامل اللفظية يعني لأن عاملها معنوي وهو الابتداء. الابتداء بحيث يعني أتي به ليخبر عنه. And early on, when we talked about al-isnad ilayhi, we shared some references related to what is al-isnad ilayhi. Briefly, basically taken from the Kawakib al-Durriya at that time, that helps to be aware of what's isnad ilayhi. That is useful. Why? Because that helps distinguish an ism. Right? Al-isnad ilayhi. Why did we mention this thing? To talk about في الدار زيد في الدار امرأة. Forget Zayd. في الدار امرأة. What are we talking about? The ism is brought there للإسناد إليه, to be talked about. What's being talked about? Right? And then we mentioned the asl is that the mubtada is definite. And it needs to be definite. Ma'rifah illa bimusawwigh. He mentions a few musawwighat. These should be charted out. These are some of the main ones. There are secondary musawwighat. Don't worry about them right now. So that is the mubtada. Now what is the khabar? He sticks here to the definition given by the author of the Ajrumiyya, right? والخبر هو الجزء الذي تتم به الفائدة. مع What do you have? مع مبتدأ, right? Right? Of course, my copy has an error in the way mubtada is written, because مع مبتدأ you أعوذ بالله, right? That's a basic orthographic mistake, right? Right? مع مبتدأ you'd have the hamza at the bottom, not at the top, right? 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 So this is a very descriptive definition. Right? The khabar is the part by which the fa'idah is complete of the sentence with the mubtada. This is a non-ideal definition for a few reasons. One, because is the mubtada itself something that intuitively people know? Something very clear? No. Because understanding the mubtada, فهم المبتدا متوقف على فهم معنى الابتداء. Right? So it's not explicitly clear, right? It's something in need of clarification. And what is the khabar? The khabar is that which the benefit is complete. Al-fa'ida. Which fa'ida? First, the fa'ida that is sought from a sentence, right? So this is the al here is referential. ما تتم به الفائدة. So it is the part by which the fa'ida is complete with the mubtada. So that thing that is not entirely fully defined in a standalone way. Partly because not everything can be understood in a standalone way. But we've said, what does appreciating the mubtada entails? Appreciating ibtida. That there's musnad and there's ma, and there's the musnad ilayhi. Right? Okay. The khabar. This definition is somewhat broad. Right? Partly because Imam Ibn Ajurrum avoid talking about the musnad and musnad ilayhi. Right? As a definition, it's not too bad because by saying ma tatimmu bihi al-fa'ida, you've kind of closed the loop. Right? That with the mubtada and the khabar. Because if the tammat al-fa'ida, you have a complete jumla. So said that the khabar is that which comes with the mubtada to make a complete sentence. Right? So it's a bit of a cheat, right? Because if you have mubtada and khabar, you have a complete sentence. So he said the khabar is that which completes the meaning, right, of the sentence when the mubtada is present. So it's a bit of a cheating, right? Because what do you do with the mubtada and the khabar? You make kalam. And kalam is qawlun mufid. Right? That's like one of the brief definitions of, if you look in the beginning, okay, al-kalamu huwa qawlun mufid, right? Kalamuna lafzun mufidun kastaqim, right? Or qawlun mufid, right? Al-Imriti, what did he say? Kalamuna lafzun mufidun kastaqim, right? No, lafzun mufidun musnadu. No, kalamuhum lafzun mufidun musnadu. Al-Imriti. Right? You can see several definitions in the opening of the Kawakib, and we'd mentioned, looking at the discussion in Sharh Qatr Nada, Ibn Hisham goes into the discussions. But either way, يفيد معنى يحسن السكوت عندها. So ما تتم به الفائدة, it's saying that the khabar is that which completes the sentence with the mubtada. But they're tricky. Right? That even, like for example, Al-Fakihi, even in a commentary that's meant to be brief and clear, points to an objection in Awdahul Masalik. The tawdih of Ibn Hisham that he refers to is Awdahul Masalik, Sharh Alfiyat ibn Malik. Right? So Alfiyat ibn Malik has many great commentaries. The most studied ones is Awdah al-Masalik of Ibn Hisham, because of who Ibn Hisham is and how beneficial the text is. Although it's tricky, but a great muhaqqiq like Ibn Hisham, his definition for the khabar in one of his higher level books has been criticized for not being comprehensive. Right? So it can be tricky. Right? Al-Ushmuni, the editor here, has a useful point from Al-Ushmuni, one of my favorite commentaries on the Alfiya. One of my regrets in Damascus was not being able to finish Ushmuni with Sheikh Abdurrahman Kharsa. We'd started. He says that the early scholars simplified the issue of when can you begin with a nakira. So the later scholars broke down the cases into what we've mentioned, right? But Al-Ushmuni says, I've sent you guys the quote in the seminary class thing on Basecamp. ولم يشترط سيبويه والمتقدمون لجواز الابتداء بالنكرة إلا حصول الفائدة. That you could make the mubtada could be nakira if there's a complete fa'idah. خلاص. Right? That's simplified. When it conveys a complete fa'idah. Of course, what the later scholars broke down were what are the cases in which the nakira conveys a complete fa'idah. So there's no disagreement. One of the reasons the earlier scholars didn't break it down fully, like Sibawayh and others, is because they're addressing people who had intuitive knowledge of Arabic. What sounds right, khalas. It can be mubtada, but when people's usages became awkward and weak and a lot of ujma affected it, then they broke it down further. Okay. That's the definition of the khabar. And this definition is sound insofar as it's complete, but there's a challenge. يعني هو الجزء الذي تتم به الفائدة, right, is the part by which the, right, and those curious could look for other definitions, and you'll see it's not that straightforward, right? وهو قسمان. The mubtada, the khabar is of two types. مفرد وغير مفرد. Right? And the mufrad, and here the mufrad refers to, it's not a jumla or akin to the jumla. ما ليس جملة أو شبه جملة. Right? 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 Because the mufrad has, and here Al-Fakihi refers to a book of his own. Right? He says, Al-Mufrad lahu itlaqatun arba'a. The Mufrad has 4 usages. And Al-Fakihi says, كما بينت ذلك في الحدود وشرحها. Al-Hudud here is referring to his book Al-Hudud al-Nahwiyya. It's a very useful, small treatise. It's printed on its own, and it also has, and he commented upon it. شرح الحدود النحوية. It's a useful risala, comes up with the core definitions of Nahu, and he breaks things down, and there's useful points. So there's several, so we have al-ism al-mufrad. What's the ism al-mufrad? What's the definition of al-ism al-mufrad? No, al-ism al-mufrad. ما ليس مثنى ولا مجموعا. Of course, nitpickers would pick on that definition because ma technically includes everything, but ma is a general word, but what's meant by it is the ism that is not مثنى and مجموعا. Well, it's obvious, right? It's not the dual or the plural. Here, the mufrad في باب المبتدا والخبر, what's meant by it is ما ليس جملة ولا شبه جملة. Okay, so what's the example of the mufrad? فالمفرد نحو زيد قائم. Right? The khabar is والزيدان قائمان والزيدون قائمون, because by the mufrad we mean وزيد أخوك. Right? So by mufrad it's not meant the ifrad of lafz of the khabar, but rather عدم كون الخبر جملة أو شبه جملة. Right? That's the maqsood of the mufrad. Right? That is, the khabar is not jumla or shibh jumla. Okay. And that's a simple khabar. So he doesn't expand on it a lot more, doesn't give us Quranic examples. Why? Because it's like the plain vanilla khabar. Right? وغير المفرد إما جملة اسمية نحو زيد جاريته ذاهبة وقوله تعالى ولباس التقوى ذلك خير. Are we in the right place? Right? وقل هو الله أحد. وإما جملة فعلية نحو زيد قام أبوه وقوله تعالى وربك يخلق ما يشاء وقوله تعالى والله يقبض ويبسط وقوله تعالى الله يتوفى الأنفس. Right? وإما شبه جملة and we'll see what the shibh jumla is in a second. Right? So the khabar that's غير mufrad is three things. Jumla ismiya or jumla fi'liya, and the shibh jumla which is dharf, and the jar and the majroor. Okay. So the jumla اسمية نحو زيد جاريته ذاهبة. Right? And of course it has to be connected back to the first sentence. So this is a sentence within a sentence. Right? زيد جاريته ذاهبة. Right? So جاريته ذاهبة is a mubtada and a khabar. Correct? On its own. But the damir here connects this micro jumla to the meta jumla. Zayd, so it's as if in a logical statement you put Zayd and then you put a bracket. Jariyatuhu dhahiba. Jariyatuhu dhahiba in brackets is a mubtada and a khabar. But how did we connect this sub sentence to the bigger sentence? Because of the presence of that damir. There has to be some connecting element. Right? So jariyatuhu dhahiba, jariya is mubtada, dhahibatun is khabar. Zayd is mubtada, and right? And this jumla is fi mahal raf'i khabar of for the mubtada, that is Zayd. Right? So Zayd is mubtada awwal. Jariya is mubtada thani. Right? Dhahiba is khabar of the mubtada thani. Right? And the mubtada and khabar thani are jumla ismiya fi mahalli raf'i khabar of the mubtada al-awwal. But this secondary jumla needs a rabit. What is the rabit? It's the damir, the ha that connects it back to the first sentence. والرابط بين المبتدا والخبر الهاء من جاريته. Right? So this is, you have this refers to jumla sughra and jumla kubra. A sub-sentence, the jumla sughra, and a jumla kubra. Right? Okay. وَلِبَاسُ التَّقْوَى ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ. Right? لِبَاسُ التَّقْوَى ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ. Here لِبَاسُ التَّقْوَى, libas is mubtada. التقوى مضاف إليه. لباس التقوى. Right? ذلك is مبتدأ ثاني. خير is its khabar. And the jumla, ذلك خير, right, is في محل رفع خبر of the مبتدأ الأول. And what is the رابط is the اسم الإشارة ذلك. قل هو الله أحد. There's multiple potential i'rabs of قل هو الله أحد. Right? There's multiple possible i'rabs of قل هو الله أحد, depending on a few things. What is meant? How do we do i'rab of huwa? Right? Because one i'rab, and there's multiple i'rabs and each convey different subtleties of meaning. You say huwa is mubtada, right? Right? But that depends on how you understand huwa. Because what you can say, قل huwa Allah. And then what is ahad, right? So we're going to pause here, and I want you guys to do a little bit of hard work. I want you guys to dig a little bit, look in what are the i'rabic possibilities, reasonable i'rabic. I don't want a fancy, far-fetched, unlikely i'rab, no ijtihad, right? For قل هو الله أحد, right? And they convey a range of meanings. The simple i'rab that's given by Al-Fakihi here is, and you can he gives us one possibility, you can look at that. قل هو الله أحد, right? 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 And you can look at you could look at Al-Kawakib Durriya as well, but there's a few points. Right, and here والجملة الفعلية نحو زيد قام أبوه. So قام أبوه is a jumla fi'liya, and it's and this jumla fi'liya has its internal i'rab, and it's في محل رفع خبر of the مبتدا. ربك يخلق ما يشاء. يخلق ما يشاء. يخلق هو ما يشاء. جملة فعلية. It's في محل رفع خبر of the مبتدا. الله يتوفى. يتوفى الأنفس. يتوفى هو الأنفس. فعل فاعل مفعول. Right? This جملة من فعل وفاعل في محل رفع خبر of the مبتدا. That's very straightforward. So there's the exercise there. And the jumla can also be a dharf. The khabar غير مفرد can also be شبه جملة. Right? It also can be شبه جملة. And we look at that next time. with the other investigations related to the khabar, and then ahkam related to the mubtada and khabar together. There's a number of verses, with i'rab. Please do them. You have 1 week respite because we have not finished this chapter. Please take notes from the beginning of the text. And then we'll move on to the nawasikh, باب العوامل الداخلة على المبتدأ والخبر بإذن الله. And these are straightforward in of themselves, but many extra details are being brought in now. So keep those in mind. We'll stop here. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وسلم. The Kawakib al-Durriya